Hello, I'm Becky Sayers, aka Atmos Sayers1, aka the passionately boring teacher, and I've decided to film a video that shows the authentic process I go through when planning a lesson. This is not designed to tell you how to do it, this is just designed to show you how I do it, and the method that I think works quite well for me. To give you a little bit of context on the lesson, this is a Year 8 slavery unit. It's towards the end of the unit, so pupils have just done about 5 lessons on the abolition of slavery, and throughout that really pushing the importance of abolition. This lesson is designed to look at the significance of abolition and give it a little bit of context to talk about the fact that just because laws were introduced banning slavery didn't mean that slavery was over. After this lesson we would then go on to look at modern day slavery. A bit of context as well, we have really good centralised resources within our school, so this is designed to be a resource that can be easily adapted by teachers for their different classes. It's not designed with a particular group in mind. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started. You'll notice that I'm writing fairly quickly. I've put this clip, or at least the start of this video, on double speed, and I'll probably speed it up or slow it down at different points. Essentially, what I wanted to do with this video was just create a bit more of an organic process. I did start breaking it down with a previous lesson about World War I, but I think in reality it was becoming quite staged, and I wanted to show you how I actually do it on a day-to-day basis. So this is a lesson on the slave trade and specifically on the significance of abolition, particularly within the British Empire. And the conclusion that I really want my pupils building towards is that just because slavery was legally abolished doesn't mean that slavery didn't exist. So I've decided on my question, which you can see I've written at the top, which is to what extent did the 1833 Act, so the Slavery Abolition Act, end slavery? And what I've started to do now is sketch out my overall ideas. Now, I've not written a full model in this case. What I've done is plotted out a table which I will use later on in lesson, and written down the points that I would like my students using and the examples that I would like them using. And the reason why I've not written a model in this case is because they've written a couple of similar paragraphs within this unit and across the course of this year, so I will be able to easily pull another similar model that I can use, which will have the added benefit, if I show it to them beforehand, of meaning that they can't just copy my answer. So I'm sitting there sketching out my ideas on my scrap bit of paper, and when I'm doing that, you'll notice I'm also writing down a couple of examples that I want to use. So I'm not only sketching out the key points I want them to have in their writing, but I'm sketching out the key points I need to include in the reading that I'm going to write. So below that, I'm starting to sketch out any key questions that I'm going to need to ask in order to pull out those key points. So I'm going to want to ask about the effects of continuing to trade with countries that still allow slavery to exist. I'm talking about the result of a lack of compensation, and I appear to be having a little bit of a think now, or at least a conversation maybe with my other half. I'm having a think, you can tell by my drilling my fingers, and I'm also going to have need to talk about the importance of apprenticeships and objections to apprenticeships, which I'm going to put beforehand because I think that's probably going to be the first paragraph that I'll write. Once we've been through that process, we've done the reading, we've answered some key questions, I'm then going to ask them to plot their overall opinion on this question on a scale, placing huge importance on the fact that that giving these opinions is not binary. And you'll notice that I've already roughly decided where I'm going to plot my opinion. As I think it's important that I do actually have an opinion that I'm almost trying to convince pupils of, while also presenting them with different bits of evidence. And below that, I'm now starting to, first of all, in the bottom right hand corner, plot out what I want their answer to eventually look like, so an overall opinion, and then expanding on the arguments in their overall opinion in up to 3 paragraphs. And now I'm starting to plot out the themes that are going to come up in my reading. Now, one thing that obviously isn't getting counted in the 56 minutes that it took me to plan this lesson from beginning to finish is the huge amount of reading that I'd done beforehand. You'll see that I'm using James Woolvin's Short History of Slavery to just get a few figures and examples while I'm writing my reading, but I've done a huge amount beforehand, so it may have taken 56 minutes from start to finish now, but actually it took substantially longer than that once you take into account all of the prep work and planning scheme of work that I had to do beforehand. Okay, so we should be approaching the end of this section now, and I'll then take this and start putting it into a Word document, which we can see here. I've developed a really common structure to all of my lessons in terms of formatting, margin size, where the title goes, line spacing, where the keywords go. Not only really helpful for my pupils, but really helpful for me. I just don't have to think about it. I always put keywords at the top, but you'll notice that I haven't put any keywords in yet because I'm going to build those up as I write the reading. These are keywords which are either bits that they need to understand within the reading or bits that are going to I'm expecting them to use in their writing. Now what I'm doing here is I'm trying to find a definition that I'd used in a lesson earlier in the unit. One of the key points of this lesson is talking about the definition of slavery, because if you define slavery as just not being paid for work, then it would be really easy to say that slavery was abolished at the very latest at 1838 when the apprenticeship system stopped. But I want to have a bit more of an in-depth definition. This is me messing up with the camera. I want to have a bit more of an in-depth definition in which I emphasize that it's the idea of being forced to do something, not having an option but to do it. And if you take that definition of slavery, then this allows you to look at apprenticeships and problems with lack of compensation through a very, very different spectrum. Apparently I'm doing a little bit of research at the moment. So I've got my definition of what a slave is, which I've taken directly from the first lesson in the unit. I'm going to ask them to discuss it and then write down their definition, both as a little bit of recall and to just really emphasise the importance of that definition. And once they've done that, we're then going to do a reading which outlines, let's have a look, 3 major points. It talks about the nature of apprenticeships after abolition, the nature of compensation for slave owners, and British trade with countries that still used slavery. Just as a side note, while I am apparently not at my desk, you'll notice that throughout the text I kind of chop and change between referring to slaves and referring to enslaved people. I know that the more modern term is to talk about enslaved people, but I was trying to do it in such a way that I was using that wherever possible, but also I felt compelled to use the word slave at some points in order to ensure that it sounded grammatically correct. So as you can see, I'm starting to type my answer now. I'll probably speed this bit up, but I'll just talk you through my process. So I've got my notes on my bit of squared paper. You can see it below me with that reference book. I work my way through the plan that I've put together. Every now and then I will stop just to check a fact, and you'll find that as we go through this slightly quicker section of the reading, that I will add keywords and remove keywords as I go. I think there was a point where I'd referred to the textiles industry and I put textiles up as a keyword, and later on I decided, well, the keywords list is just getting a little bit large, a little bit overwhelming. I didn't really need to refer to textiles, so I removed that, which meant that I could also remove it from the keywords list. Once I'd finished writing, you'll also see I spend a little bit of time adding a couple of images. These images aren't just to beautify the text, but they're also designed to show things that pupils may not have seen before, or to just enrich the paragraph a little bit. So at the bottom of the paragraph, bottom of the writing, I've included a picture of a cotton mill so that we can have a bit of a chat about that, and factories. And then at the top in the second paragraph about apprenticeships, I've included a poster about objections to apprenticeships as well. So I'm going to speed this up now and go quiet so that you can then have a time lapse that will take you through me writing the reading. sure you don't want to listen to Flight of the Bumblebees for a third time, so I'm going to jump back in here just while I'm doing those last little cosmetic bits, messing around with the lines, making sure that the pictures line up nicely. If you slow down the video, you should be able to see how I make sure that the pictures don't throw everything out of whack by using a mixture of the grid lines and wrap text to make sure that everything fits perfectly. So after this step, you'll notice I then start doing the next phase of my sheet, and you'll notice that this doesn't quite match up with my planning, where I then decided to do some checking for understanding questions. What I've then decided to do on this sheet is jump a few steps and go straight into the continuum, where I look at the lesson objective question: to what extent did the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 end slavery? Now, I'm not intending to do this next in my lesson, but this is the next thing that I want pupils to do on their sheets, which is why I'm doing it now. I tend to do the whole Word document as one and then move on to the PowerPoint. That's not an ideal way to do it. I think that's comes from experience. Quite often I talk to my trainees about how observing a really experienced teacher can sometimes be really, really misleading, because they're going to make things that the trainee will find incredibly difficult, incredibly complicated, look really effortless and look really easy. It's not because it is effortless or easy, it's just because their bucket is relatively empty because they've done it so often. So I'm able to hold all of that in my brain simply because I've planned this way for a couple of years. So at the moment I'm just putting together the teacher copy of the sheet. I do the teacher copy, and then after that I will create the student copy all within the same document. And essentially this just means that all of the answers are going to be there. And that includes any particular thoughts that the teachers who haven't planned this lesson may need to emphasise. So, for example, one of the points that I come back to on several occasions when planning this lesson is the fact that slavery doesn't mean you're not getting paid. Our definition of slavery very much comes down to this idea of choice. You can be paid and still be considered a slave. So what I'm doing on the screen at the moment is taking the question and dissecting it. So things that I feel pupils are going to need to know before they even attempt to give an overall opinion later on in the lesson. We need to remind them of the definition or the meaning of to what extent, what an act is, that we're specifically talking about the law and the effect of that law, and we're talking about slavery and what it means to actually be a slave. So these are notes that I'm expecting students to annotate on their own work after a discussion, but they're also notes for the teacher as well. Now, once I've done that, I will then make a continuum, which pupils will use to plot their opinion. I might do this by having the students discuss it in a turn and talk, stand at the front of the room in a continuum with the door being one side and the window being the other, and ask them to explain their thinking. Or I may just do a turn and talk and then get them to write. But this is designed to be kind of an overall rehearsal and discussion of the opinion that they'll eventually be doing. As I said, I'm not going to do this straight after the reading. This is going to come after some checking for understanding questions and another stage which is going to go on my PowerPoint. But it's the next stage which is going to appear on this sheet. So I'm going to just really quickly time-lapse this. I'm going to time-lapse it without Flight of the Bumblebee, and then we'll carry on. Okay, so you'll notice that now I've written, or I've just started, or just finished writing my overall opinion. What I will then do is just put a couple of those points in bold. I'm not looking for pupils or any teachers teaching this lesson to reproduce my exact opinion word for word, but what I am looking for is for those really, really core points that are basically the aim of the lesson. So this idea that just because somebody isn't called a slave doesn't mean that they're not a slave, and just because Britain had legally abolished slavery didn't mean that it didn't implicitly support slavery in other countries through things like trade. So now that I've got my overall opinion, I kind of stepped back a little. Well, no, I haven't stepped back a little bit on this sheet actually. I've then thought about them planning their overall answer. This is going to be essentially when I say to them, okay, you've got X amount of time, here's your planning sheet that you can use, off you go. And I'll do that as a table. And when I do it as a table, I will fill in the first box, which is designed as a model, either for me to put under the visualizer and slowly reveal and say, well, here's how I would have done it through discussion, or for teachers teaching this lesson to take and sort of use as a live model under the visualizer. So once again, I'm just going to really quickly time lapse it so that you can see me making that table and making that first example section, which very much reflects what I want them to be writing, and I will pick back up with you when we get to making the PowerPoint presentation. Right, really sorry, I know I said that I would meet you back at the PowerPoint presentation, but there is one more thing that I want to talk about. So I finished making the table, and what you will now notice is that I'm going back through the document, and I've made a copy of it at the bottom of the sheet. This is essentially me creating the student version of it. I put it all in one document so it can all just be printed out. And I'll make the student version first, I make the teacher version first, and then once I've made the teacher version, I then essentially make the entire thing again, but wherever I put answers in, I replace it with blank spaces, with a rough amount that I think the students are going to need. If you want to do this, my advice would be put in more lines than you've originally given yourself, because funnily enough, pupils tend to write much larger than 12-point Calibri. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm just taking out any answers, making sure, I think, to remember to remove my point on the continuum. There have been a couple of times when I've left that in and I've had to pretend that it was deliberate all along. But this should just mean that there is an exact mirror, which then makes it much easier for me to model things, do a little bit of a Blue Peter moment if I need to, but it also means that I don't have to sit and produce a live model of everything, which is going to give me more of a chance to circulate. So I will now meet you back at the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, hello again, and we are now at the PowerPoint presentation. The only reason that little box appeared is because we have automatic todays in history, which requires us to update a spreadsheet, so we're not going to worry about that. So I found that over time I've used PowerPoint less and less, particularly as I've switched to this double planning method. This is what Doug Lemov calls it. And I tend to use my PowerPoints for pictures or for checking for understanding questions that I want planned in advance, so things that I'm going to use the individual whiteboards for, or really, really important questions that I need to not forget. At the moment, the little bars that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen, they're a little bit of a relic from when I first started teaching about 8 years ago. I have to admit, I largely keep them now for aesthetic sake. I just like having those keywords at the bottom and also having the objective at the bottom of the screen. It's not saying it's necessarily good practice for anything you should do, but it's something I do. One thing that you will hopefully notice is that I do have an incredibly standard PowerPoint design. This is a previous lesson, I think it's the lesson one before this that I'm currently adapting, which saves me a huge amount of time, and as I've said earlier, just it saves me a huge amount of brain power. You'll also notice the relic of the arrow, which originally would have been stuck into people's books, and they would have ticked the one that they felt they achieved. We don't do anything like that now. I mainly use the arrow just to make sure that I'm still giving my lessons a little bit of structure. So I'm essentially removing the old lesson, keeping bits of formatting I know I'm going to want to keep, and then pasting in the bits from the new lesson. So this lesson is, or this PowerPoint I should say, because PowerPoint is not the lesson, this PowerPoint is going to first of all have the Do Now quiz on it that we start every lesson. I don't write that until I've taught it, because I believe that it should be individual or until I've taught the class, so I believe it should be individual for every class, same with the feedback slide. And then after that, when we get into the meat of the lesson, the first thing I'm going to do is that turn and talk about the definition, there we go, of slavery, which I should put up in a minute, but I just seem to be dithering about with my mouse. So, because again this is a centralised resource that multiple members of staff are going to use, I believe I put the question, but then I also put how I want that to be discussed, whether I want it to be a turn talk when everybody writes or whatever it is, just to give a little bit of a nudge, especially for those less experienced members of staff, to know what to do. So turn talk and I'm apparently doing both. So that's one of the reasons why I use PowerPoints. As I said, I also use it for those whiteboard questions, and I'm going to use it for a table a little bit later on, which I didn't put on the sheet. I'm not quite sure why I didn't put it on the sheet, probably to keep it all within a neat two-sided format, but either way. So, you'll notice that during this planning process I'm flitting really closely between the PowerPoint and the Word document. I want to make sure that the Word document and the PowerPoint exactly line up, especially if you have lower prioritizing pupils. That could be something that would really, really throw them. And I'm just starting to do my multiple choice questions now that I've sorted out the little bar. Now, if I remember rightly, I should really briefly switch back to my notebook, because I spent a little bit of time planning out the specific multiple choice questions that I'm going to use. Funnily enough, that question about Wilberforce is not a question for this lesson. And when I do that, I'm looking for two things. First of all, I'm looking for whether they understand really key pieces of vocabulary, and I'm also looking for whether they can understand the chains of reasoning that I want them to be able to form later on in the lesson. So hopefully you will be able to read it. I think at one point I notice when I look up at the screen that you can't actually see what I'm writing because the little box is in the way, so I move my book over a bit, but hopefully you should see that my first question is, what did the Act do? Because if they don't understand what the Act did, and we've got issues with problems like abolition, or remembering what abolition was, is a key problem. Now this is a question that I would definitely ask during the reading as well, but it's on the board. A is a bit of a belts and braces type affair, but also if I'm having a bit of a mare that day, just to remind me that I absolutely need to secure that before we move on. So, what did the Act do? What an apprentice was as well. And then I've got the third question down there. I do. Reasons why apprenticeships were very similar to slavery, and that's like building up to that chain of reasoning that I'm going to want them to talk about later on. I'm then going to ask them to define compensation. I'm going to ask who received compensation, because again, if they don't understand that, they're simply not going to understand why it trapped a lot of formerly enslaved people in a cycle of poverty. Then we're going to again explore that chain of reasoning of why people would have been forced to work on plantations and why people would have been stuck in a cycle of poverty, making sure, which I think is the note I'm about to make, there we go, making sure that when I talk about enslaved people being caught in a cycle of slavery, I don't let pupils fall into the trap of saying that all slaves are unskilled and therefore had to work on plantations, because that simply isn't true. And then exploring that final chain of reasoning, talking about how Britain continued to support slavery indirectly, even though it had officially abolished. I think, yep, I added a question there specifically talking about cotton as well, so we can link that back to the Industrial Revolution. Now, these are going to take a variety of forms on my presentation. Some of them are going to be multiple choice questions because I really want them to just be a quick check. And some of them are going to be longer answer questions because I want to see if they can manipulate that knowledge. All of them are designed to be completed on individual whiteboards, but obviously some just simply require more time than others. So we'll do another quick time lapse while I create these questions, and I will meet back up with you when it comes to the table. But before we do that, actually, really quick point to note while you're watching these multiple choice questions is to have a look at the distractors that I use. Some of the distractors are designed, well, the different distractors are just designed to check different things. It's kind of I would describe it as a spectrum. If pupils choose one particular option, they're right, obviously. If pupils choose another option, that might suggest that they just need a little bit of tweaking. If pupils pick another particular option, it might mean that they're way off. and they're going to need some proper reteaching. So if you look carefully at those distractors, hopefully you should see where that's in place. And you'll also see, which is what I'm doing now, some of the distractors I've specifically taken from previous bits of work that they've done in order to make sure that they're as convincing as possible, so that pupils can't just take a guess because it's really obvious what the right answer is. So now I will meet you back at the table. Okay, so now that I've made, the multiple choice questions, the last little step is to make the table, which is actually going to be the third step in the lesson after the reading, so, well, fourth, so it would be definition of slavery, reading, checking for understanding questions, and then looking at this table. And now that they've just started to explore those chains of reasoning relating to apprenticeships, compensation, and trade, I now just want to get them to classify them and expand them that little bit more, so that when they put them into that planning table, they're able to construct chains of reasoning independently. So this is largely just taking the ends of the spectrum that we saw on the spectrum, putting them into a table, so that they'll do this table, as you'll see in a second, and then they will do the spectrum activity, and then they'll plan and write. On the scheme of work, this is down as taking approximately 2 lessons, because these are fairly beefy activities, and I think it's really good that as a school we plan according to how long a topic's going to take, rather than everything kind of having to fit within a really neat parcel of one lesson. You'll notice that I'm also making a second slide. I'm essentially doing exactly the same as I did on the word sheet. I'm making my answer key, which will come afterwards, which I could print out and have in front of me if I needed it, but it is relatively, well, it lines up with what you would have seen in the reading. And yeah, I think all of this goes by the principle of you're not you when you're stressed, you're not you when you're hungry. My bucket is still, after almost 10 years of teaching, really quite full while I'm teaching, and I know that if I haven't prepared all of these answers beforehand, my teaching tends to be of a lower quality. So I think once I've finished this table, that's pretty much it. I have a really quick look back at the Word document just to make sure that everything's in line, and then I finish the lesson. And before I finish the video, I just really want to emphasise that this is purely how I choose to plan, and this isn't a staged version. This is genuinely how I plan lessons day to day. And if you want to steal something from it, please go for it, but I'm not saying that anybody should do this. This is just something that has worked for me. And there was something else that I was going to say. It was clearly very important, but I have apparently decided to forget at this exact moment. And I know that there are some bits of my lessons, like maybe the keywords at the bottom, which are a little bit archaic, but hopefully I've explained my reasoning behind them. Hopefully this will be part of a large series where I look at things like how I do checking marking, or how I do planning, how I plan schemes of work, or even how I plan different types of lessons, and hopefully this has been helpful. So I will now leave you to it, and you can finish watching me produce a lovely table on PowerPoint. Thanks very much.